Okay, so thank you very much, everyone, for joining this afternoon for the Transport Infrastructure Planning sort of update. My name is Stuart Thompson. I'm the Head of Public Affairs at BDB PITMANS, and as you would expect, if the slides work, you have to have the obligatory, here's what the firm does. So BDB are a law firm, but I'm not a lawyer, so this isn't a sort of a legal update on where we are with the law around planning infrastructure and things like that. I head up the specialist public affairs and communications team. So the sorts of work that the firm does is based around, often around local government. So I know one of my colleagues recently gave a talk on clean air zones to the TCI, but we do a lot around sort of consultation issues, more generally governance and public law type issues. So that's why we have the association with the TCI and have been involved in them for quite a long time. But I say, I'm not a lawyer, so this isn't a legal update. This is really looking at where we are in terms of policy and policy development, because frankly, everything the government says and does at the moment, it seems, has a direct impact on transport infrastructure more generally across a range of different sectors. But in particular, then the ramifications for engagement with communities, with stakeholders, with local government requirements, other parts of the public sector. So there's some quite wide ramifications for a lot of what the government is doing currently, although it isn't always necessarily explicit about some of the implications of what they're talking about, particularly in terms of engagement and consultation. So I've got about 10-15 minutes. Plenty of time for Q&As afterwards, should there be any. But if anybody has any particular queries they'd like to ask, then do just either unmute themselves if they're able to do that, or pop them in the chat, and I'll respond. If they sort of fit as we're going through, that's fine. I'll answer them then and there. If they sort of fit at the end, and I'll just collect them all together, I'm happy to do that as well. So that's generally how the sort of next 10-15 minutes will work. In the first place, when we're thinking about what government is up to in this sort of space, fundamentally, what we tend to do is lose sight of the reason that any political party is elected into government in the first place, and the basis of which they're elected into government. And that's fundamentally the manifesto that they put before the electorate. We often get a range of sort of new policy papers, new consultations, new white papers, whatever they may choose to call them, and it's quite easy to get distracted by a lot of those as they come through. Not that they're not important, but fundamentally the basis upon the government, the activity of any government is the manifesto. So we should always keep that in mind, and because that remains as a general guide for how any government operates. The trouble is that then keeping up to date with what's coming out of government can be quite tricky, because there's a whole range of different policy papers and consultations, and other aspects, and they don't always get a fanfare for the big shiny new announcement. In fact, you could say, I know these have now been changed, but trying to keep this very contemporary. Some of the changes around the COVID restrictions locally certainly didn't get a fanfare, and that's why the reaction against them was as strong as they were in terms of perceived local lockdown. So we don't always get that fanfare. So you always have to have a way of keeping track of these things and having some sort of monitoring system in place, so you know exactly what government is trying to do at any time soon. We've also seen a lot of announcements recently that aren't going to come into effect for some time. So they themselves are the subject of consultations, across planning and a number of other policy areas. We have a big fanfare for those particular policies, and government, the railways would be another recent example, big changes, big perceived changes. But actually, the reality is they can often take quite a long time to come into place. So there's a long period where we have to keep up to date, keep tracking, keep engaging, and keep working with government to try and influence that policy outcome as well. And for those on the receiving end, particularly locally, but amongst developers and others as well, that can be quite difficult, because what was initially announced and what comes out later isn't always the same thing, and we have to bear that in mind. So say the rail reform, which was announced last week, lots of big picture stuff, but actually the detail, possibly legislation, possibly more consultations will come. So we have to track these things over time. So really that consultation and engagement, I think, is ongoing. But as I say, as a guide, we've had the Queen's, the manifestos. We've also had the Queen's speech recently. We've had local and mayoral election manifestos as well. So keep coming back to those as the basis and the drivers for any political engagement and any priorities that a government or a politician, a mayor, will have. In terms of the key priorities of this particular government, I mean, you can't go anywhere past levelling up. That is fundamentally, what is driving most of the policy there. There are other themes, particularly on the post-COVID recovery, the economic recovery, making sure that is spread throughout the country, again, coming back to levelling up as well. But the government was also talking about global Britain. So thinking about the trade deals and the way that we deal with countries around the world, Australian trade deal recently, but Japanese and other trade deals as well. But a more outward-facing post-Brexit type Britain, again driving that policy agenda. And then the final area, arguably more important than anything else, is climate change, and with COP26 coming up at the end of this year, still as we talk today. It's still expected for the end of the year, probably still in person, but again, I believe some of those decisions have still to be made. So we can expect more policy announcements in all of these different areas. And again, the hashtag that the government will often use is Build Back Better. So this is their sort of catch-all term to cover a lot of these sorts of activities. But actually, levelling up is the one that they are reasonably obsessed by at the moment. Looking at transport and infrastructure in particular, what we've seen, as well as levelling up, is a push towards devolution. Now, you could argue, I would argue, that the future of mayors across England, we're talking about here, the future of mayors across England has been saved by the re-election of Andy Street in the West Midlands and Ben Houchin up in Tees Valley as well. Both big name Conservative mayors. The Conservatives lost mayors in other areas west of England and Cambridgeshire in particular, but they had a lower profile. Those two were the really big high-profile mayors they had. And in particular, Ben Houchin sort of came to represent, if you like, the levelling up agenda. There were lots of announcements across transport and infrastructure, free ports, so in his his constituency, in his patch, a hydrogen scheme as well, government jobs to Darlington, Darlington station redevelopment, gigabit broadband, the hydrogen hub, as I mentioned, that's one of the big schemes that they've got, improvements to the airport. So a whole range of different ways that actually levelling up could be proven were brought in by Ben Houchin. So you could say he was the sort of the poster mayor, if you like, for levelling up, but for the Conservatives pushing forward into the north of England in a way that they haven't done for, you could argue, quite a long time. So that's the specific, but more generally, because those two mayors have been re-elected, it means that the Conservatives will continue, I believe, to push for mayors and to push for more devolution. If they had lost, I think you would have seen that that push towards devolution probably would have come to an end. So now it is a fundamental way that the Conservative Party can lean into and gain votes in former sort of Labour voting constituencies, which they can push at the next general election in 2022, 23, depending on how we look at it. And again, the Hartlepool by-election recently, you could suggest is an example of the success of that approach, because the Conservatives won quite convincingly there as well. But having said that, of course, I mean, these things are quite easy to sort of brush over completely and say, well, it's all about, the Conservatives pushing into the north and winning Labour votes. But equally, some of this agenda, particularly in terms of levelling up, is having an impact on Conservative seats further south as well. And there were some, although it must be said quite limited, inroads that the Labour Party made at the last set of local elections into some Conservative, traditionally Conservative voting areas. And I've just mentioned, a couple of mayoral wins as well. So what does that mean for us? Again, sorry, coming back to the transport and infrastructure side of things. Well, one of the consequences of levelling up is that the government has, the Treasury has rewritten the Green Book. Now, the Green Book is the sort of the assessment criteria in effect that the government uses to assess new infrastructure projects. And that's sort of been appraised. I mean, it was sort of reviewed post budget 2020, and those changes have now been incorporated. You know, and it represents quite a change. So in effect, there is now more focus. I'm not a technical expert on the Green Book, but what it does do, the changes mean that there's more focus on projects that facilitate levelling up. So we're seeing very concrete ways that the government is changing its policy agenda to make sure that it delivers on the levelling up agenda. We're also going to get a levelling up white paper later this year, although the times have changed slightly. And I quote, that will set out bold new interventions to improve livelihoods and opportunities throughout the UK. We've also already got the Levelling Up Fund. That's in place to give finance to local infrastructure plans. And then, of course, we've then got the big sort of set piece infrastructure developments like HS2 and Freeports as well, which are absolutely central to the government's agenda here. One of the beauties for the government is that levelling up has a degree of flexibility about it as well. So whilst here I'm talking more about the transport and infrastructure side of things, you can also apply it to life chances, education, skills, etc., all to prove that there's a shift in the way that government is treating, you know, the country outside of London and the South East. And indeed, the appointment by the Prime Minister of Neil O'Brien MP to be a levelling up advisor, one of the things that he will do is to make sure that the agenda can cut across traditional government silos, across you know, government departments as well. We've also got the National Infrastructure Strategy that was published at the back end of 2020, and that sets out the plans to transform the UK infrastructure in order to you know, deliver and strengthen the union. And part of that is the union connectivity review as well. That's fine. Sorry, just checking messages there just to make sure I wasn't doing anything too wrong there. So we've got the union connectivity review as well. There's been an interim report. There's more coming. So again, if you're looking for infrastructure policies and proposals, the union connectivity review is of fundamental importance as well. And that national infrastructure strategy, when it was published at the back end of 2020, also promised a whole range of additional papers, some of which we've seen and some of which we haven't. I say the Union Connectivity Review, we've already got an interim form. There was a construction playbook which was promised, that's out. We've got the rail plan, which we mentioned there. The energy white paper, that's already out as well. Then in the longer term, we've got a net zero review. Well, that seems to be coming. We've got the Transforming Infrastructure Performance 2021. We've got a transport decarbonisation plan, the white paper on devolution, as I've already mentioned, a hydrogen strategy, an industrial carbonisation strategy, which is already out, and a refreshed industrial strategy as well. So a whole range of different parts, all related to that initial one paper. Again, you can sort of see why it's quite complicated to track these things over time as well. And actually on the industrial strategy, it looks like we're sort of moving away from having one at all. There's a sort of the Building Back Better paper, which came out, I think, at the time of the last budget. Seems to be the sort of the new way that the industrial strategy is being dealt with as well. We've also got a national infrastructure assessment. The next iteration of that will come out, I think, second half of 2023. So that's a little bit away from that. And of course, government has to respond to those as well. So look, some of these papers we get, some of the papers you don't. Some of the papers you get come out in a slightly different form to the one that was originally, you know, agreed to by government. We've also got the National Infrastructure Bank, which is, again, I quote, working with the private sector and local government, it will lead a shared mission to accelerate investment in the country's infrastructure. You know, it's very much part, as the Chancellor said in the foreword to the document, part of the sort of the Building Back Better agenda. Planning, I mean, I won't go into the details of what's being proposed in planning because I think it will emerge and very much change over time. But what we are seeing is that the planning changes and the planning bill that's been mentioned in the Queen's speech for a faster planning system, I think there's and there's an emphasis on homes and infrastructure in particular, speeding that up. It's very much the case that there will be implications for certain parts of the country, i.e. the south. It seems that there will be more pressure on housing. So again, we need to be aware of that, and then the ramifications for central government policy making as well. And then the other side of that's all very central government focused, but then on the local government side of things, again, I won't rehearse the the Clean Air Zone debate, so you can always watch back my colleague Laura and others at the TCI event a couple of weeks ago. But there are more tools that local authorities will start to use. Workplace parking levies, for instance, maybe to pay for other parts of local transport. We've seen quite a lot of disquiet over cycle and bus lanes, low traffic neighbourhoods as well. So, the local government agenda in terms of transport infrastructure is very much one to look at, both from its impact side of things, but also from the engagement and consultation side as well. I'm hoping that the slide now moves on. Excellent. So, just to sort of summarise a few of those points there in the time available, I think there will be continued tensions between central and local government. And I think in the white paper that eventually comes out, we have to be aware of the retained central government control, despite the talk of more powers for local government. I think that's there as well. The Levelling Up Fund, for instance, is meant to be for local authorities to bid for. It certainly is, but actually it's decided by central government. They decide who gets the money, and all the rules are set by central government. So that means there's an emphasis on local MPs, mayors, councillors and others to be lobbying and engaging with central government, as well as thinking about what their own authorities are doing as well. We've got big infrastructure projects. There have been a number in recent recent months that have sort of taken a bit of a battering, he says, sort of with various delayed decisions. Now, when I talk to my colleagues who deal with a lot of the planning issues around these big infrastructure projects, one of the issues that keeps coming up, or is a possibility that is, more emphasis may be required on, is that early and persistent engagement with key stakeholders and local communities as well. So when you look at, I've got a list here, but Thurrock Energy Centre, Thanet Offshore Wind Farms, Hornsey 3 are all examples of delayed decisions. Again, there are very specific reasons why they've been delayed, but consultation and engagement may well have helped as part of that. We have to be aware that that levelling up becomes a sort of a catch-all term for everything that the government does. Now, that may be good, that may be bad, but we can't be blinded to policy initiatives that come forward and need to be engaged on just because it's got the levelling up term around it. And it doesn't mean to say that it will definitely go through. Again, referring back to the planning reform, just because the government wants it to happen, if there's a big outcry, then there's no guarantee, particularly from its own members, but the public as a whole as well, there's no guaranteeing that those measures will go through. And I think the other thing which to finish on, but is worth sort of thinking about, is around the timing of the next general election. So I put 2020X, 23 or 24. There are a number of issues that will come up that will help a government decide whether to go for an early election. So they're changing the Fixed Term Parliament Act so they can basically have the election whenever they want. I think the COVID-19 inquiry will be one of those because no government, or the government, will not want to have that at the time, will not want to have to deal with the outcome of that inquiry at the time there is a general election. As we're talking today, Dominic Cummings is talking to the Science and Technology, Health, Social Care Select Committee sort of jointly, and it's very clear that there are a number of issues which the government could have addressed differently, better, etc. All of those a public inquiry will doubtless dig into. So if you're going into an election, you don't want to have to talk about those things as well. And there's a danger that the election becomes the absolute focus without, and has an impact on all other policies going forward and all other projects going forward at the expense of everything else. And that might be a worry. So, generally thinking about, consultations, I think there will just be more of them. Government will need to engage more. And I think you may have, given the economic uncertainty around the country still, that some issues, such as road charging, that would be a big political hot potato to deal with, may well start to come back up the agenda. So even more controversial issues, which require more consultation and engagement, might start to be issues that the government has to look at. And that's without talking about sort of local power generation schemes and others that may come forward as well. So look, I hope that sort of covers in the time available, and apologies, we've been sort of slightly constrained in our timings today. But I hope that gives a good idea of some of the issues. I'm very happy to take questions now, but there are my contact details. If anybody would like to follow up afterwards on email, phone, via Twitter at Red Politics, I'm very relaxed about that. So I know we've got some time for questions if any come in.
Can you hear me now? I think I've
Sam, yes, I can hear you.
Hi, right, brilliant. Okay, I thought that was really helpful. Thank you. And it's sort of a really good overview. I did have a question about you sort of covered it at the end, but when you were talking about sort of local tools, I've seen quite a lot of, particularly from London boroughs. Some of their transport people are really pushing for road charging as a means of both sort of plugging a potential fuel duty gap for central government, but also tackling congestion. Do you think that's going to, it feels like, given the sort of that is probably a London-centric problem at the moment, but will swiftly grow, and it's probably not just London. Big other infrastructure centres like metropolitan centres like Manchester and bits of the northwest probably have similar congestion issues. Do you think we'll see that getting bolted onto some of the environmental agenda as well, to reduce car use, be it electric or petrol, in the near future?
I think you're entirely right. I think that would be my suspicion as well. I mean, certainly we've done work, or my colleagues have done work in Bath and Birmingham on the sort of clean air zone side of things. There's two aspects to that. One is that government likes to sort of, push what could be politically controversial issues down to local authorities to deal with, and that's these are very much in that sort of area. So that suits government down to the ground. It can say that it's got this great environmental, agenda, but it's up to others to deliver it and deliver the good bits and, well, say good and bad. I don't quite mean it like that. I suppose a bit more difficult and more acceptable sorts of issues. So I think that will undoubtedly be the case. But I think also for some authorities, and I think Manchester sort of fit in this. If I'm trying to remember, I think Andy Burnham did have a sort of a green manifesto, or a programme which he announced, I think about midway through his first term, something like that, about the environment and what Manchester was doing about the environment. If it could be absolutely part of the reputation building of any local authority, but particularly a city globally. So if you're Manchester, Liverpool, Leeds, whatever, London, and you want to think of ways of attracting inward investment, then actually promoting yourselves as the greenest city in England, the greenest city in the UK, whatever it happens to be, would be a very good way of doing that, because it attracts people. People want to live in nice places, he says very simplistically, but as long as you can get round, as you say, electric car usage or trams or better cycle infrastructure, whatever it happens to be, green spaces, all these things sort of come together. So I think, yes, they will do it partly because there's demand for it, partly because they're going to have to do it because of health. There's going to be pressure from their own electorates to do it, partly because central government might tell them they have to do it, or the courts might say they have to do it. But also sensibly done, they can do it because it's actually good for their reputations as well. So I would agree with that. I think I definitely agree with your analysis, Sam.
I think if I can ask one more, if that's all right.
Sure.
I've relatively recently moved from London up to Scotland, and I was working on Heathrow expansion, which is probably quite a good example of a project that's been sort of hit by delays or various other things, both COVID and court cases and that sort of thing, which I think in part No, actually, some of that is about sort of a shifting government mandate, as it was a kind of tumultuous time in politics post Brexit, with numerous prime ministers and that sort of thing, with different views on Heathrow in particular. But I guess my question is more about thinking about the sort of devolution agenda. There is a bit of a distinction between sort of English local devolution and what we've traditionally termed as devolution, which is out to Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland. And in the wake of the past year, where actually people in the devolved nations have a far sort of closer relationship, that's probably the wrong way to put it, but with their devolved administrations, because COVID restrictions have largely been managed on a devolved level. And so sort of, over the last year, I've paid much more attention to the government in Edinburgh in some ways than Westminster, because it has more of an impact on my daily life. And much of sort of transport infrastructure is devolved, certainly to Edinburgh from Westminster. How do you think there's the Union Connectivity Review, but how do you think that Westminster, the kind of Conservative government's push to level up and invest in infrastructure, will interact with a SNP administration in Edinburgh? Is effectively what we've been talking about on this call going to finish at Carlisle and not move any further north?
I think the answer to that would be no, it won't. And actually, maybe that's a really good thing that I should have made a little bit more of. And that's one of the other sort of main parts of the government's agenda, is that, it's sort of, we had a Brexit referendum. We're not part of Europe or the European Union anymore. Sorry, we are still part of Europe, not part of the European Union anymore. Boris Johnson does not want to be the prime minister that breaks up the United Kingdom as well. Yeah. So there is no doubt that another key driver, and as you say, the Union Connectivity Review is absolutely part of that, is to keep the union together. Now, on the one level, I don't think there's much to it yet, because because they don't really know how to push against the SNP's demand for another referendum. Yeah. And they also can't think much further than beyond sticking a Union Jack on, beside projects. Now, look, frankly, the European Union did that. If you walk around Wales, sorry, this is going to sound terribly London central as well, but you walk around Wales, parts of north of England, southwest, etc., where there was the regional, structural funds from the European Union that were spent in parts of the UK, particularly Wales, southwest, and some parts of Scotland as well, and they all had, the stars logo on it. Just because you put a logo on it doesn't mean that actually. So he can stick a Union Jack on stuff, and that's fine. Nobody will take any notice of that. So I think it's a fundamental misunderstanding, and almost he is being like the European Union that he tried to escape from. Yeah. So I don't think that really helps. On the other hand, you will see more projects across all parts of the UK, including Scotland particularly, and Wales to an extent, and Northern Ireland a bit, although they seem to do reasonably well post-COVID anyway, post Brexit anyway, in terms of spending. So sorry, it's a really long-winded answer, but no. So I think there will be more emphasis on that. I think the government will start to come up with a proper strategy to do that. But the fundamental problem is there is a government in Scotland that doesn't want that agenda to work. Yeah. So there will be a pushback in a way that other parts of the country, you could argue, doesn't happen quite so much. But also that's related to the fact that mayors across England are effectively newer than the Scottish government, Assembly before, etc., the Welsh Assembly, and now the Senate and all that. But, so people in Scotland and Wales, to a lesser extent Northern Ireland, are just more used to the devolved structures and the powers that they have. In England, these things are new, and people are still sort of getting used to them. We need some personalities. We need more Andy Burnhams and Andy Streets and others to really show people what those mayors can achieve for areas. So I think it's still to play for. I think you'll see more of it, but I'm not going to speculate as to whether it would be successful or not, frankly.
No, quite. I guess there's a bit of a question there about how that actually ends up getting delivered, because in even in Manchester, or if we think about roads as an example, but or rail, but certainly on roads, the trunk road operator for England is Highways England, which reports to the Transport Secretary in Westminster. Yep. Actually, that isn't true in Scotland. There is a question as to how Westminster, in a practical sense, would fund major infrastructure north of the border when the state agency responsible for delivering that doesn't answer to Westminster, it answers to Edinburgh. And so I think there's a load of niggly issues there that sort of I mean, I haven't heard anything sort of come out of government as to how they plan to sort of square those circles in some ways, if you have a administration in Edinburgh which is resistant to sort of Westminster controlled money being spent, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. I mean, there's not high speed rail in Scotland or connected to Scotland because Scotland didn't want to pay for it and Westminster didn't want to pay for it. I did some work on it years ago, and that was the fundamental problem with it. And I agree. I don't see any way over that. And the other part of that is that you see Matt Hancock, Secretary of State for Health. He's not the Secretary of State for Health in Scotland.
Yeah.
But he's still politicians. I'm not just picking on him, although Dominic Cummings has picked on him today. He talks about health as if it's one thing, and it's not.
Yeah.
And apologies, Sam. I think we have to call it a day. I think the Zoom line is now required for other parts of.
No, fair enough.
So apologies.
Sorry.
I really appreciate your time. That's been really helpful.
No, that's fine. And to say, if there's any follow up with anybody watching later, or Sam, if you have following today as well, thanks for the questions. Then do feel free to get in contact.
Sure.
Thank you very much for that, Stuart. That was an excellent session. I very much enjoyed it, and thank you for sticking around and doing the questions at the end.
No problem.
Yes, we're going to call an end to it now, and we shall see you all shortly for other things, we hope.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye bye.